what do you think that we are getting wrong when it comes to dealing with men's mental health?
Um, the lack of empathy. I think fundamentally
Mm,
everything comes back to when you're talking about men and boys, and like you said, I was a co-founder of the Men and Boys Coalition here in the UK. I'm currently chair of the male psychology section of the British Psychological Society. I do a lot of advocacy around men and boys issues. I also do that in my personal life as well. As a father of a son, and I go in to my son's local, I'm a school governor, and I go into my son's local school as a volunteer as well, and I read with boys who are behind on their reading. I think every single domain, every single area that I look at and that I have colleagues looking at, whether that be, and we kind of have these kind of big five, and I've set myself up now to not be able to name them all, but we have like boys in education, we have vulnerable boys and men, for example, homeless or prison population, victimized men, men and mental health, and probably one other. But no, I said I set myself up to fail. But across all of those domains, I think everything is coloured by a lack of empathy around men's issues. It's really hard to get people engaged and even believing that men not only have issues, but that those issues are then worthy of our attention. Because there just seems to be multiple barriers of saying, well, people will either go, well, men don't have problems. And then you show them the stats.
mm,
Pick any stat, 75% of completed suicides are by men. Suicide is the number one killer of men under 55 in the UK. 90% of the homeless, no, 80% of the homeless population is men. 90% of the prison population. Take any of those stats and go, okay, well, okay, men might have problems, but they're men, so screw them, type thing. And that feeds from the kind of attitudes that we have around men and masculinity more broadly, is that we should, I don't know, I be tough enough to deal with it, or that we should deal with it alone, or that it's not our problem, or even when you then delve down into more sinister attitudes about potentially men being more disposable, or that men have brought it upon themselves, or that it doesn't matter because they're men, even to the point where you delve down even more sinisterly, that it actually is a good thing that most men are in prison, that most prison population is men, or it's a good thing that, um, you know, I mean, I've seen the hashtag kill all men, trend on Twitter a few times. I've never seen a corresponding one for women, and not nor would I want to. So I think for me, the challenge always tackles back to empathy towards men and a chronic lack of it societally, and you see it peppered everywhere. And one of my favourite quotes is a quote by Hillary Clinton where she said, I'm going to paraphrase, it's not quite exactly what she said, but she said the greatest victims of war are the women and children left behind, which I think is such a powerful quote, in the sense that it just completely erases surely the ultimate price you're paying is to die.
mm.
And if that's the majority of men who are at the war, at armed services, and we know the majority of armed services are men, it just shows how those quotes just completely spin the narrative to frame and place, the suffering of women and girls, which we've become very, and rightly so, very familiar with, and we're doing lots about. But you take any given issue, you get met with this kind of paradox of um, erasure for men in the picture. So, for example, if you have an issue where the overwhelming majority of the victims, so say, for example, rape and serious sexual assault, the overwhelming majority, so 90% of those are women and girls. So men are erased because we say, okay, that's a female issue. Okay, fine. So then if you take a corresponding statistic and say, okay, well, 90% of the prison population is men. Should we not try and understand a bit more about why men are violent? The only ever pieces I see about gender and prisons is, how do we make prisons better for women when they're 10% of the population? So men fall through the gap at both turns. They can't be seen as minorities. They can't be seen as majorities. It's just any issue isn't worth examining in relation to men. So I think that's the biggest challenge.
Yeah. The, the conversation is challenging because men are seen as disposable, and people only think about men and all of the horrible things that potentially that men did. And then you ask someone to think about a great man in their life, and
mm,
they do, and it helps them sort of change a little bit. Then they can see some common humanity in the other men, and how
mm,
can we draw that out in our young boys, right?
mm,
Because I think we've sort of over rotated on one side of our masculinity, of like telling boys to just like stand
mm,
back, be quiet, let other people
mm,
step on you. That's not what our society needs. Our
mm,
society needs dynamic young boys who are sometimes tough and can pull themselves up by their bootstraps, because that's part of life. Like, if I get knocked down, I got to get back up. But when I do get back up, how can I ask for help? That's like teaching that
mm,
sort of idea. I can pull
mm,
myself back up, but I also have my buddy or my mom or my sister or my best friend
mm,
to say, "Hey, I'm struggling now. I got myself back up, but I need a little bit of extra help." And so teaching this full spectrum of masculinity. I was
mm,
talking to another guy, and he said masculinity is like a hammer, and I like that, because one, the hammer can be used to smash someone in the fucking face. Excuse my
mm,
language, right? Or it can be used to build a home,
mm,
right? So inherently, if we teach young boys that they're just bad and toxic from the beginning because they're men, then they're obviously going to do bad things, or they're going to
mm,
step away from society and remove themselves, which is also what we don't need or want. But if you
mm,
teach them that they can learn to utilize this beautiful thing they have inside of them, which is their innate energy, to build, to nurture, to reciprocate, to cooperate, to be tough, to use their body as
mm,
a strength, not as to something to dominate. Like, that's what
mm,
we can be teaching people. And I think you're 100% right with just this lack of empathy that arises when we look at men like, oh, they can figure it out. Like, they don't need
mm.
anyone's help. They'll be fine. Like,
I
clearly
just,
that's not
yeah,
true. Boys are struggling in school.
yeah,
Boys aren't going to university.
yeah,
There's a
yeah,
lot of boys who aren't having sex, which like may seem like that's not a big
yeah,
deal, but it is, because they're not going out into the world and speaking to
mm,
other people. Whether they
mm,
want to have they want to have sex with, they're not even trying,
mm,
and that's an issue. And so
mm.
those are the things that sort of pop up for me when I think about mental health and
Yeah,
masculinity and things of that
I
nature.
think with what you were saying is in terms of we're just not having balanced conversations about the issues because
Mm.
nobody, well, certainly not me and not anybody reasonable that I speak to is talking about any of the kind of progress and the discussions and the reforming around women's rights, and women's gender role as a negative thing, and saying that it's ruined things for men. It hasn't. We're just where's the corresponding side of the coin? Where's the other conversation where we say basically if we're going to um, develop and blend and equalize this kind of female gender role and give the choice and say, okay, well, if you want to go into more masculine things and do this, if we're going to break down that side, we've just left men where they were. There's been no real proper dialogue about it on a big societal level in a way that kind of really brings in some of the kind of pivotal or lone voice moments where we have some who are doing it. And I think my main person is kind of Harry Styles in that sense that he's the one who's trying to, um, you know, break a lot of those kind of stereotypical images down. And being on the cover of here and cover of there and doing good things. But these aren't the conversations the boys are having in school, whereas girls aren't.
Right.
Girls are having those empowerment conversations in school about they can do whatever they want to do. We're not having those conversations with boys. And I really like your hammer analogy because, if you flip a hammer round, you can really kind of carefully and tactfully take out a nail and correct a mistake. It's it's about really visualizing and expanding what we view masculinity to be, hopefully to a point where we have these archetypes, but they're not binding in any particular way, and that we can flexibly utilize any part of our kind of selves that we want to and that feels right to us at any given moment. But we're just we're just so far behind in where we need to be in terms of a lot of those conversations. And it is difficult because I mean, I'm a gender psychologist. That's my kind of origin. So I know just how complicated it is to answer the question, are men and women inherently different, or is it all from the environment? There isn't really an answer. It's got to be a little bit of one, a little bit of the other. So can we envision and say, yeah, there's going to be a society where there's no such thing as masculinity and femininity and everyone's blending in one big melting pot and doing whatever they want? Probably not, because there's probably enough there to say, there's something going on. There are some immutable, issues and differences there. But by the same token, we're clearly still in too much of a restrictive place where we're saying you can only operate in this way or this way, based on whether you're a man or a woman and everything associated with that. And I think we just need to have conversations where we get to a place where some kind of happy medium where people are okay and that men aren't killing themselves in droves every single year. There's got to be some kind of place in the middle.